Welcome back, Sebastian here. So today I want to do kind of an in-depth look at my expected points model. I've talked about this stat quite a bit in videos for the last couple of years, but I've never actually done an in-depth look at exactly how it's calculated and some of the factors that go into calculating those stats. So first I just want to kind of go over, what's kind of the rationale behind it, and then we'll do a deeper dive into how it's made basically. So basically, this model came out of me asking the fundamental question, how do you assess race performance? And I think, right now there's two really kind of more simple metrics that are really the common ones. One is points, how many points a driver scores, and what an average, basically driver's average finishing position is another kind of relatively easy one to calculate. You just take a driver's finishing position for, all the Grand Prix in a season and you calculate them. And that can sometimes be a good way to basically make up for basically drivers having, poor reliability, for example. But I really want to look at this and say, fundamentally, race results are reliant on qualifying results. If you qualify well, you're likely going to finish well. And so I wanted to make a model that was as much as possible entirely reliant on race results, and that's kind of where this expected points came in. It kind of got some inspiration from hockey with like expected goals, basically expected goals saved above expected, and so that's kind of the inspiration for me making this model. So there's really two main factors that this model uses, and that is the starting position in every single Grand Prix in a season, as well as how strong a car is. And we'll get into how those are calculated a bit later, but it's relatively simple. It's basically just those two factors by themselves. Now, when you look at the historical data, and this is from all of the Grand Prix from 2014 all the way until 2024, you break down the cars into three groups: front runners, midfielders, and backmarker cars. And you basically graph the data. You can see that there is a pretty clear trend where the farther up the grid you start, in all likelihood, the more points you score on average. And you can see the relationship in the curves themselves actually are quite different. For front runners, it's the best curve that fits the data is a power model, whereas for the midfield and back markers, it's an exponential model. And like you would make sense, even if you're in a front running car, at least historically, maybe not this season, but at least historically, if you start from the pit lane, start from the back of the grid, on average, you can usually still get some points. At least that's how it's been before this season, I would say. So that's kind of shows the fundamental breakdown and how each of the curves kind of work. Now, how is car strength calculated? This is a really tricky question, and there's many different ways that in theory you could do this. One is points. Just basically you take all the teams in F1 history, use a standardized point system, just do points per race, and use that to basically calculate how strong a car is. You can use a team's average finishing position as well. Take all of a team's finishing positions, basically just take the average of that. That's another way. But something that while making this, I realized was kind of an issue is something that I would call the bad number two driver problem that you would sometimes see where, teams that had Felipe Massa in the early 2010s at Ferrari, or, Red Bull with Perez the last couple of years, and having a really, really underperforming number two driver can really skew those results, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So these are the results from the top four teams in the 2024 Constructors Championship. So of course, McLaren, Ferrari, Red Bull, and Mercedes. Now points: McLaren 666, Ferrari 652, a bit of a drop, 589 for Red Bull, and then a big drop as well for Mercedes, 468. And when you calculate average finishing position, just with all the both drivers' results, you can see that there are quite a few results. Interestingly enough, Ferrari actually had the best scores here of 4.05, McLaren second 4.38, pretty big gap to Red Bull 498, and Mercedes next with last with a 5.46. But when you change this and you do average minimum finishing position, and we'll get to how that's calculated in a second, it does, I think, paint a much more representative picture. McLaren are fastest overall, 2.21, Ferrari 2.46, Red Bull's third. Interestingly enough, that they're third, not ahead of Ferrari with a 2.62, and then a bit of a gap to Mercedes with a 3.67. But what I want you to know is that when you look at the difference between the average finishing position, average minimum finishing position in brackets, you'll see that Red Bull actually has the biggest jump, the biggest jump in terms of how in between the two numbers. And that is almost entirely because of the fact that using this method, it basically eliminates kind of a number two driver, really weighing the team's results down. Now, of course, if you have two really bad drivers, that's kind of a problem. And that's something that is definitely a limitation of the model as it's currently constituted. But generally speaking, I think it still is, pretty good overall. And you can see, I would say, the two driver lineups that had the more balanced teammate head-to-heads, at least last year, the two Ferrari ones and the Ferrari and the Mercedes ones, you can see that they make the smallest kind of change between average finishing position and average minimum finishing position, which is a bit of an interesting one. Now, another one kind of on the opposite end of the scale is from 2014. And this is basically the bottom of the Constructors' Championship. So 2014 Marussia, courtesy of Jules Bianchi, scored those two, miraculous points, I guess some would say, at the 2014 Monaco Grand Prix, whereas Sauber, Caterham, neither of them scored any points. Interestingly enough, looking at average finishing position, Sauber was the best there, almost over a full position ahead of Marussia on 14.7 compared to 15.78, and then Caterham was just kind of miles behind on 16.5. But when you calculate average finishing position, it does paint a slightly different picture. That Marussia was maybe slightly better than Sauber at 14.18 compared to Sauber's 14.21, and then again Caterham being quite far adrift at 15.82. So again, none of these, models are perfect. None of these metrics are perfect. But I do think, overall, this average minimum finishing position is, quite good, quite useful, and is probably one of the more consistent metrics that you can use to calculate, how good cars were in terms of race performance. Now, in terms of calculation of this average minimum finishing position, you basically take all of the drivers' results over the course of the season. You split the season in half. And the reason that it's important to split the season in half, at least when you're calculating for Formula One, is that you do have development over the course of the season. Some teams can get a lot better over the course of the season. Sometimes they can also get a lot worse. And so basically by doing it where you split the results in half and you calculate each half separately, it means that you basically you can see kind of the fingerprint, I guess, the footprint of that development. Because otherwise, for example, seasons like 2023, where McLaren started off horribly and then ended very, very, very strongly. Basically, if you calculate using this method, it will basically just completely eliminate those bad results from the early part of the season. Whereas if you basically split the results in half and then calculate separately, I think preserves kind of the original, development flow much better. So basically what you do is you take each driver. So here we have Verstappen on the left, Perez on the right, and I believe this is for Red Bull last year. And you basically, for one driver, you basically sort all the results in both starting position and finishing position from best to worst. And then for the other driver, you do it the opposite. And then again, you do that for the second half of the season. And for basically each row, you take the minimum result. So for example, for the top row, Verstappen had a win, Perez was a DNF. So you basically just take the win. And sometimes you have to be careful with this and make sure it doesn't accidentally calculate the DNFs. Takes the DNF value, which is just a 0. So that can skew things as well. But basically, you can see here at least that for the majority of these results, it's taking Verstappen's data and not taking Perez's. So you have to go all the way down to these results here where, Verstappen had, I think, a fifth and a sixth, and Perez had, a third and a second, and then a second where, Verstappen had a mechanical reliability. So you can still see, I would say 80% of the results are from Verstappen's side. So again, it's taking you're picking for the best results for a car, and not picking, the worst results, because that's generally the best way to calculate, is that you're trying to aim for those highest results, because it's closest and most closest to the absolute limit of what that car is actually capable of. So when you basically go do that, and then you calculate the average for each of these results, average minimum for finishing position 2.62, and for the starting position 2.29, which suggests that the Red Bull car last year was slightly better in qualifying than it was in the races. Now, when you make these curves, like I showed before, the three curves with the one for the front runner, back marker, and midfielder, but then basically within each of those equations, basically you can make modifications to the power to the exponent, and that can basically change. You can basically shift that curve depending on how strong the car is. So if a car is stronger, you can basically make the exponent smaller, and that can basically means that it will be one of these higher curves, a little bit higher up on the graph. Whereas if the car is a little bit worse, maybe not so strong, it's one of the ones down towards the bottom of the graph, and that's how you can basically adjust for how strong a car is. Now, of course, there's quite a few other things as well, and some of these are things I've added over the years. So, of course, when I first kind of released this 2 years ago, it was just very, very simple with none of these extra stuff. But I realized, looking at the data, and you can see, like, looking at patterns and stuff, that there are other factors to consider. And some of those other factors are things like tire wear. So if a car has really, really good tire wear or really, really bad tire wear, then that will obviously affect the calculations as well. So when, for example, you look at here, basically what I use as a proxy for this is I basically take the delta between this starting position and finishing position, and I basically then feed that back into the equation, and that kind of affects the equation result. So if, like, this is a really positive number, so if the finishing position is much, of course, low numbers are good or fast in Formula One, right? So if this is a really small number, and this is, let's say this is a 5, then that would suggest this team has really, really good tire wear, assuming it's a modern F1 season. And so basically you can factor that into the equation, and you can basically, help to account for that. If it's the inverse, if you're, the 2019 Haas, 2023 Haas, for example, and these stats are kind of the flip the other way around, you can also take that into effect and maybe make the car act a little bit worse than, how you would account for where it's starting. There's some other things to take into account. Crazy races. So when you just get these crazy fluke results where, you have, 4 or 5 front running cars all DNF, they all crash into each other, or they just have mechanical reliability, and you end up with, a couple midfield teams on the podium. You end up with a back marker getting a bunch of points. I've, added something this year to try to account for that, to kind of smooth over some of those effects. And in fact, the inspiration for this was the 2005 Indianapolis Grand Prix, the US Grand Prix in 2005. If you haven't heard, if you don't know what happened in that Grand Prix, go check it out. Probably one of the most controversial races in F1 history. But basically 6 cars finished, 4 of them were back markers. A bunch of these back marker teams got their only points of the season. And having that would, really affect the results as well. Now, of course, historical season, especially early 2000s, I think, or even the 90s, 80s, if you go back further, reliability was really, really poor. You'd have mechanical reliability of like 20 to 30% for some of these seasons. And this year it's very, very low. It's like 3 or 4%, I would say, for this season. And so that's obviously something that you have to account for. I'm not sure how... I don't know what the full effect of the historical reliability is yet, because I haven't calculated some of those seasons from the early 2000s yet. But again, it's something that I might have to, account for. But again, as we're recording this video, we're not sure. But of course, in terms of just mechanical reliability, other DNFs, I'll kind of show you how that is taken into account as well. So again, for the crazy races that I kind of mentioned before, what I do is I basically calculate a buff for each individual race. So this is for this season. And you can see that for the first race in Australia, you only had 14 finishers. And so for this first column, that's basically just the number of finishers for each Grand Prix. And then the strength is basically the average minimum, this average, finishing position, minimum finishing position for each of those cars that finished. So if this is a low number, like in the 6s, then that means that it was biased towards front running cars. But if it's a lower number, like in the low 7s, so you can hear there's this one here that's a 7.4, a 7.3, then that suggests that actually more midfield cars finished the race compared to front runners. So that, again, front runners, maybe a couple of them DNF'd. And then using those two numbers, you can basically create a buff where if it's a big positive number, it basically says that all the drivers in that race, especially the back markers, midfielders, they would be expected to score, a little bit more than they would in kind of an average race. And so you can see how that would be calculated for all of the other races. If you're curious, it's blue because it was a wet race there, just to help me keep track of that. And that's for a video that will be coming out a bit later this year. Now, there's lots of different things that can happen in a race. So, for example, mechanical reliability. So these are basically just the results from this year so far. And you can see for Alonso, there's 2 red boxes are for the races where he had mechanical issues. So for those races, basically it's not calculated. And so for each of the races in the season, it's just kind of summed up. So each race would be just added together, and that would basically create a sum of, the expected points that you'd be able to score over the whole season, because it's like a probabilistic result, right? So, and then that would be compared to how many points they actually scored. Of course, if you have, seasons where a driver just has really, really bad luck, really bad reliability, you want to make sure that that is not like reflected in their performance, because again, this is ideally supposed to reflect driver performance, right? So for mechanical retirements, like I was mentioning, those basically are removed, so basically not included in the calculations. Withdrawals, like Stroll had in Spain, or just mechanical DNSs, where cars just not able to start the race because of some mechanical issue, those are also not included, as are technical disqualifications, which is what happened to Gasly in China. Of course, if a driver gets disqualified for non-technical reasons, like they do something like, if, for example, Verstappen had actually gone a black flag last time out in Spain, that would have been like included in his calculation. Now, another one that I think is maybe a bit of a more controversial one, but this yellow box here for Hajar is non-technical DNSs. So these are for if a driver does not start the race, but it's basically their fault. So for things like crashing on the formation lap, which is exactly what Hajar did in Australia. So those are basically kind of the different ways that, things that happen in a Grand Prix would impact or not impact that score. Now, of course, you have things like drivers basically being crashed into, and that can basically have a really negative effect on kind of the overall result of a race. So, for example, if a driver doesn't do anything wrong, they get crashed into, that could obviously really negatively affect their score. But unfortunately, with those kinds of things, it's very, very hard to apply that consistently, especially for historical races where there's not a whole lot of information. So for those races, I just kind of leave them as it is, which again is sometimes unfortunate, especially if for whatever reason you have a driver who has like a lot of really bad luck, like they get crashed into, really, really bad strategy. But again, unfortunately, that's something that's very, very hard to control for. And I'm just kind of, trying to focus on what, is controllable, such as things like mechanical reliability. So there you go. There is my explanation of my expected points model. Maybe not the most exciting video, but again, I think given that it's a stat that I've made myself, and that, it's not really an explanation of it isn't really readily available anywhere, I thought it was useful to kind of make a video talking about that and just kind of giving it more in-depth breakdown of how that's made, how it's calculated. So again, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.